Let me return to the issue of the diversity of regimes of subjectification. A further dimension of heterogeneity arises from the fact that all ways of governing others are linked not only to the subjectification of the governed, but also to the subjectification of those who will govern conduct. Thus, Foucault argues that the problematization of sex between men for the Greeks was linked to the demand that one who will exercise authority over others should first be able to exercise dominion over his own passions and appetites. For only if one was not a slave to oneself was the competent to exercise authority over others. Foucault, 1988. Minson, 1993. Peter Brown points to the work required of a young man of the privileged classes in the Roman Empire of the 2nd century, who was advised to remove from himself all aspects of softness and womanishness. In his gait, in his rhythm of speech, in his self-control, in order to manifest himself as capable of exercising authority over others. Brown, 1989. Gerhard Ostrich suggests that the revival of Stoic ethics in 17th and 18th century Europe was a response to the criticism of authority as ossified and corrupt. The virtues of love, trust, reputation, gentleness, spiritual powers, respect for justice, and the like were to become the means for authorities to renew themselves. Ostrich, 1982. Stefan Collini has described the novel ways in which the Victorian intellectual classes problematized themselves in terms of such qualities as steadfastness and altruism. They interrogated themselves in terms of a constant anxiety about an infirmity of the will, and found in certain forms of social philanthropic work an antidote to self-doubt. Collini, 1991, discussed in Osborne, 1996. Whilst these same Victorian intellectuals were problematizing all sorts of aspects of social life in terms of moral character, threats to character, weakness of character, and the need to promote good character, and arguing that the virtues of character, self-reliance, sobriety, independence, self-restraint, respectability, self-improvement should be inculcated in others through positive actions of the state and the statesman. They were making themselves the subject of a related but rather different ethical work. Collini, 1979. Similarly, throughout the 19th century, one sees the emergence of quite novel programs for the reform of secular authority within the civil service. The apparatus of colonial rule and the organizations of industry and politics, in which the persona of the civil servant, the bureaucrat, the colonial governor, will become the target of a whole new ethical regime of disinterest, justice, respect for rules, distinction between the performance of one's office and one's private passions, and much more. Weber, 1978. Hunter, 1993. Minson, 1993. Duguay, 1994. Osborne, 1994. And of course, many of those who were subjected to the government of these authorities, indigenous officials in the colonies, housewives of the respectable classes, parents, school teachers, working men, governesses, governesses, were themselves called upon to play their part in the making up of others and to inculcate in them a certain relation to themselves. For this perspective, it is no longer surprising that human beings often find themselves resisting the forms of personhood that they are enjoined to adopt. Resistance, if by that one means opposition to a peculiar regime for the conduct of one's conduct, requires no theory of agency. It needs no account of the inherent forces within each human being that love liberty, seeks to enhance their own powers or capacities, or strive for emancipation, that are prior to and in conflict with the demands of civilization and discipline. One no more needs a theory of agency to account for resistance than one needs an epistemology to account for the production of true defects. Human beings are not the unified subjects of some coherent regime of domination that produces persons in the form in which it dreams. On the contrary, they live their lives in a constant movement across different practices that address them in different ways. Within these different practices, persons are addressed as different sort of human being, presupposed to be different sort of human being, acted upon as if they were different sort of human being. Techniques of relating to oneself as a subject of unique capacities worthy of respect run up against practices of relating to oneself as the target of discipline, duty, and docility. The humanists demand that one decipher oneself in terms of the authenticity of one's actions runs up against the political or institutional demand that one abides by the collective responsibility of organizational decision-making, even when one is personally opposed to it. The ethical demand to suffer one's sorrows in silence and find a way of going on is deemed problematic from the perspective of a passional ethic that obliges the person to disclose themselves in terms of a particular vocabulary of emotions and feelings. Thus, the existence of contestation, conflict, and opposition in practices which conduct the conduct of persons is no surprise and requires no appeal to the particular qualities of human agency, except in the minimal sense that human being, like all else, exceeds all attempts to think it, simply because whilst it is necessarily true thought, it does not exist in the form of thought. Thus, in any one site or locale, humans turn programs intended for one end to the service of others. One way of relating to oneself comes into conflict with others. For example, psychologists, management reformers, unions and workers have turned the vocabulary of humanistic psychology to account in a criticism of practices of management based upon a psychological or disciplinary understanding of persons. Reforms of the practices of welfare and medicine have over the last 2 decades turned the notion that human beings are subjects of rights against practices that presuppose human beings as the subjects of care. Out of this complex and contested field of oppositions, alliances, and disparities of regimes of subjectification come accusations of humanity, criticisms, demands for reform, alternative programs, and the invention of new regimes of subjectification. To designate some dimensions of these conflicts, resistance is itself perspectival. perspectival. It can only ever be a matter of judgment. It is fruitless to complain here that such a perspective gives one no place to stand in the making of ethical critique and in the evaluation of ethical positions. The history of all those attempts to ground ethics that do appeal to some transcendental guarantor explain enough. They cannot close conflicts over regimes of the person, but simply occupy one more position within the field of contestation. McIntyre, 1981. Folds in the soul. But the question may be asked, are not the kinds of phenomena that I have been discussing of interest precisely because they produce us as human beings with a certain kind of subjectivity? This is certainly the path followed by many who have investigated these issues, from Norbert Elias to contemporary feminist theories who rely upon psychoanalysis to ground an account of the ways in which certain practices of the self become inscribed within the body and soul of the gendered subject, e.g. Butler 1993, Probing 1993. For some, this path is advocated unproblematically. Elias, for example, did not doubt that human beings were the type of creatures inhabited by a psychoanalytic psychodynamics and psychoanalytic psychodynamics, and that will provide the material basis for the inscription of civility into the soul of the social subject. Elias, 1978. I have already suggested that such a view is paradoxical, for it requires us to adopt a particular way of understanding the human being that carved out at the end of the 19th century as the basis for an investigation of the historicity of being human. For many others, this pathway is required if one is to avoid representing the human being as merely the passive and interminably malleable object of historical processes. If one is to have an account of agency and of resistance, and if one is to be able to find a place to stand in order to evaluate one regime of personhood over and above another, for one example of this argument, see Fraser, 1989. I have suggested that no such theory is required to account for conflict and contestation, and the stable ethical ground apparently provided by any given theory of the nature of human beings is illusory. One has no choice but to enter into a debate which cannot be closed by appeal to the nature of human being as a subject of rights, of freedom, of autonomy, or whatever. It is possible then that one might write a genealogy of subjectification without a metapsychology. I think it is. Such a genealogy, I suggest, requires only a minimal, weak or thin conception of the human material on which history writes. Peyton, 1994. We are not concerned here with the social or historical construction of the person, or with the narration of the birth of modern self-identity. Our concern is with the diversity of strategies and tactics of subjectification that have taken place and been deployed in diverse practices at different moments, and in relation to different classifications and differentiations of persons. The human being here is not an entity with a history, but the target of a multiplicity of types of work, more like a latitude or a longitude longitude and at which different vectors of different speeds intersect. The interiority which so many feel compelled to diagnose is not that of a psychological system, but of a discontinuous surface, a kind of enfolding of exteriority. I draw this notion of folding loosely from the work of Gilles Deleuze, 1988, 1990, and 1992, probably 1993. The concept of the fold or the plait suggests a way in which we might think of human beings. We might think of human being without postulating any essential interiority, and thus without binding ourselves to a particular version of the law of this interiority whose history we are seeking to disturb and diagnose. The fold indicates a relation without an essential interior, one in which thus what is inside is merely an enfolding of an exterior. We are familiar with the idea that aspects of the body which we commonly think of as part of its interiority, the digestive tract, the lungs, are no more than the investigation of an outside. This does not prevent them from being valorized in terms of an apparently immutable body image taken as the norm for our perception of the contours and limits of our corporeality. Perhaps then we might think to the grasp that modes of subjectification have upon human beings in terms of such an enfolding. Folds incorporate without totalizing, internalize without unifying, collect together discontinuously in the form of pleats, making surfaces, spaces, flows, and relations. Within a genealogy of subjectification, that which will be enfolded will be anything then that can acquire authority, injunctions, advice, techniques, little habits of thought and emotion, an array of routine and norms of being human, the instruments through which being constitutes itself in different practices and relations. These enfoldings are partially stabilized to the extent that human beings have come to imagine themselves as the subjects of a biography, to utilize certain arts of memory in order to render this biography stable, to employ certain vocabularies and explanations to make this intelligible to themselves. However, this exposes the limits of the metaphor of the fold, for the lines of these folds do not run through a domain conterminous with the fleshy bounds of the human individual. Human being is emplaced, enacted through a regime of devices, gazes, techniques which extend beyond the limits of the flesh into spaces and assemblies. Memory of one's biography is not a simple psychological capacity, but is organized through rituals of storytelling, supported by artifacts such as photograph albums, and so forth. The regimes of bureaucracy are not merely ethical procedures enfolded into the soul, but occupy a matrix of offices, files, typewriters, habits of timekeeping, conversational repertories, techniques of notation. The regimes of passion are not merely effective folds in the soul, but are enacted in certain secluded or valorized spaces through sensualized equipment of beds, draped and skills, routines and dressing and undressing, staticized devices for providing music and light, regimes of partitioning of time and so forth. Random, 1989.